I want to begin by thanking the Backbench Business Committee for enabling this debate and the cross-party support that I've had when seeking to secure it. Before the war began, Gaza streets were lively with the sound of children. Roughly half of the population are under 18. But unlike children in the UK, Gaza's children have had to endure so much in their short lives. A 15-year-old will have lived through 5 wars, including the current conflict. Many have been displaced several times. Even so, they've never had experienced destruction and death like this. Since October, it has been clear that children have been particularly impacted by the conflict at an unprecedented and unparalleled scale. We know that the Hamas attacks have involved the killing of Israeli children. An estimated 40 Israeli children were taken as captive in Gaza. Nevertheless, more than 11,500 children in Gaza have since been killed by Israeli airstrikes and ground operations. The term war on children is echoing across the international community. Lost in the numbers are the faces, the names, the lives, and the moments of joy those children brought. Children like 6-year-old Hind Rajab, whose fate is still reported to be unknown after the car she was fleeing to safety in with her uncle, his wife, and their 4 children came under Israeli fire. More than 24,000 children have lost one or both parents. Gaza's hospitals have treated so many wounded children arriving alone for treatment after Israeli airstrikes that medical workers have chillingly coined a new abbreviation, WCNSF, Wounded Child, No Surviving Family. Obviously, unaccompanied and separated children require urgent protection and the provision of essentials. Given that these children need refuge and compassion, can the Minister clarify whether the government have considered allowing children into the UK for their safety and well-being during this conflict, as per the petition signed by over 17,000 people? For the children who have survived the bombardment, a slow and painful death looms due to the denial of essentials, the destruction of infrastructure, and the lack of aid. The healthcare system in Gaza is in crisis due to major shortages of doctors and nurses, the lack of medical supplies, and the destruction of hospitals. Small children caught up in explosions are particularly vulnerable to major life-changing injuries. More than 1,000 children have had one or both legs amputated. According to the World Health Organization, many of these operations on children were done without anaesthetic. Such horrors are virtually unimaginable for us in the UK, but it doesn't stop there. Many children are accessing well below the recommended water requirements for survival, and those under 5 are at high risk of severe malnutrition and preventable death due to famine. According to Islamic Relief, Gaza is now the world's worst hunger crisis. As I've laid out, the situation for children in Gaza is catastrophic. Unfettered access for humanitarian aid is needed urgently. But the conditions on the ground, the bombardment, the siege, and the destruction of infrastructure do not allow it to reach children and families in need. It is not hard to bring to mind Israel's Minister of Defence's announcement on the 9th of October of, and I quote, complete siege on Gaza, no electricity, no food, no water, no gas. It's all closed. Can the Minister update us as to their understanding of the legality of what many are arguing to be the collective punishment of civilians and how this has affected children? Save the Children International's Chief Executive Officer's harrowing plea demonstrates the significance of what people all over the world are bearing witness to when she says, "We are running out of words to describe the horror unfolding for Gaza's children. Most of them have been forcibly displaced, squeezed into a tiny sliver of land that cannot accommodate them. Those who haven't been forced from their homes are cut off from the basics needed for survival, far away from the little amount of humanitarian assistance that can be delivered. Children..." Give way.
I thank my honourable friend because the horrors of recent months have literally been intolerable. Israel continues to use devastating tactics which have seen far too many innocent civilians, including children, killed with unacceptable blocks on humanitarian essential aid. Does my honourable friend agree that we need the fighting in Gaza to stop immediately with a humanitarian truce now, and not just a temporary ceasefire, but a lasting, sustainable ceasefire which leads to a viable two-state solution?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and I do agree that without an immediate and permanent ceasefire, it's hard to imagine how we can change around this situation and ensure that humanitarian aid does actually reach where it's most needed. The Chief Executive Officer of Save the Children International said, "Children are enduring and witnessing horrors while the world looks on." I repeat that for emphasis. Children are enduring and witnessing horrors while the world looks on. So why is humanitarian aid not getting to children who need it? What are the blocks on humanitarian aid? According to reports, the flow of aid is being drip-fed, that although around 500 trucks a day are needed to provide basic needs, most days fewer than 200 actually make it inside, and on one day this month it is to report that only 30 crossed into Gaza itself. Human Rights Watch argue that the blocking of humanitarian assistance also amounts to collective punishment of the civilian population that poses further grave risks to children. So can the Minister update us as to their understanding of why aid is not being distributed as needed, and whether any blocks to aid would constitute the collective punishment of civilians? There is then the question of funding itself. The United Nations Children's Fund has requested $168.3 million to support its response in the occupied Palestinian territories for 2024. On the 17th of January, it said there was a funding gap of $55.5 million. And of course, shortly after the ICJ plausible genocide ruling, the UK stopped funding for UNRWA, the largest UN agency operating in Gaza, due to allegations from Israel that 12 of the agency's more than 13,000 staff were involved in the 7th of October attacks. UNRWA has since spoken of being, and I quote, extremely desperate. International aid agencies, including Oxfam and ActionAid, have said they are deeply concerned and outraged at what they called a reckless decision to cut a lifeline for an entire population. And Amnesty International has said that whilst allegations against individuals must be independently investigated, cutting life-saving assistance to millions could also amount to collective punishment in and of itself. Again, it would be helpful if the Minister could update us as to the situation in this regard. What is the latest evidence the government has seen regarding the allegations, and how are they being investigated further? And what assessment has the government made of the consequences of its decision for the children in Gaza? I know that many of my constituents are appalled that it appears that the UK continues to send weapons to potentially kill children whilst withdrawing funding that saves children's lives. I urge the government to prioritise upholding its humanitarian obligations and resume the funding. The ICJ's plausible genocide interim judgment made clear that Israel must take steps to prevent acts of genocide, and its obligations regarding children and aid is key. So can the Minister update us as to what the UK is doing to protect children in Gaza accordingly? In terms of the UK's own obligations, it would be helpful to know what the government's response is to the growing call for increasing humanitarian aid and halting the transfer of weapons or parts for weapons that can be used against children. Madam Chair, all children should be cherished, Israeli and Palestinian children. We know that children in Gaza should not be slaughtered, but they continue to be by Israeli forces in unprecedented numbers. We know that children in Gaza are enduring a humanitarian catastrophe with no relief in sight. We know that aid is desperately needed, that children need food, need healthcare, need shelter, and need water, but are just not getting it. And so I end with asking the Minister whether he will agree that an immediate and permanent ceasefire is the only way to bring about the end of the suffering of children in Gaza and to enable the urgent delivery of desperately needed aid.